Well, now we look at South Africa, where the trial of 4 white South African farmers accused of killing 2 black labourers last month has brought questions of racial tensions in the post-apartheid country back into focus. We have this report of the latest in the trial.
Barbed wire snakes the street in front of the court in Parys, a small agricultural town in central South Africa. On one side, whites flying right-wing flags decrying what they call the genocide of their people. On the other, black protesters singing "Kill the Farmer." 2 black farm workers were murdered here last month. Inside the court, 4 farmers and a police officer, all white, stand accused of their murder. What exactly happened on the day Samuel Chiekla and Shean Tangasha were killed has become a racially inflamed matter of interpretation. Tangasha's family claim he was murdered after insisting his employer give him over $1,000 in unpaid wages.
Sean went on Monday and said he was going to Bosbota to get his money, and he walked there on Monday, but he never came back.
But the murders also come at a time of extreme fear in South Africa's farming community. According to Afrikaner rights group AfriForum, a rash of violent robberies between 1990 and 2015 killed around 1,800 farmers and labourers, and farmers say they cannot rely on the police to stop them. Supporters of the accused claim the murdered men attacked the farmer. When he pressed a panic button, dozens came running.
We know that there is a complete breach of trust between local communities and the police when it comes to farm murders. Farm murders and farm attacks. Last year, for example, has been the year in which the most farm attacks ever has been recorded in South Africa. And at the same time, we hear statements by political leaders in which violence towards farmers are being romanticized.
An attempted farm attack or a labour dispute gone horribly wrong. To the protesters outside the court, the facts of the case appear to make little difference. For them, the incident is merely proof of the deep racial divisions that continue to haunt South Africa.
Now joining me to discuss all that is Dr. Femke Brandt, who's a postdoctoral fellow at the Centre for African Studies and who's done research on labour relations and racism in South African farming communities. Dr. Brandt, welcome to the programme. Now, this clearly isn't an isolated incident. It sounds as if there's been a spike in such incidents recently. Why is that?
Yes, Don, you're right. I think it's important to discuss this matter, which is certainly not an isolated incident, in the context of power and property relations in South Africa today, because the property relations in South Africa are very skewed still, where the white farmers community still own most of the agricultural land. And the tenure security and working conditions for black laborers have not improved at all. So the tensions in the countryside are really increasing. There's a lot of violence, and not always every kind of violence gets similar attention or gets a proper interpretation, in my opinion, in the media.
So which sort of violence does and which sort of violence doesn't get the attention in the media?
I think what we see here a lot is like what was also mentioned briefly in the documentary now that we just saw, is that white farmers are incredibly scared, and they present a narrative that there is a racist and political inspired violence against them as a group of white farm owners. And I'm not saying this is not true, but I think that at the same time we see in the way they respond to a trial like this is that there's really a double standard in how narratives are presented and how racism is understood.
Is the framework for this the fact that at the fall of apartheid, 90% of farmland was in the hand of whites? There was supposed to be land reform, but there's only another 7% now that's gone into the hands of blacks. Is that the problem that we're really dealing with?
Well, that's certainly the foundation for the increasing inequality also in the countryside. And not only is the land ownership patterns very skewed, A process that's also happening is that farm labor, and it should be mentioned that farm labor in South Africa is tied also to housing often. So farm laborers and farm dwellers, people residing on farms but who not always work on farms, they consider those farms their homes, but they've never had ownership of the land. And since the 1990s, farmers have also increasingly dismissed laborers and transformed labor processes so that farm workers have been moved off, sometimes abruptly, but also gradually, from the farms that they consider their homes. So there is a lot of levels to these tensions in how the land is divided in terms of property ownership and who gets to can claim belonging or ownership of land.
So why did the land reform not result in more change?
First of all, I think that the land reform mechanism is problematic because the South African government chose to use a willing buyer, willing seller mechanism, which means that those farmers who were willing to sell their farms and the government had to pay market prices for those farms, only those farms were considered for redistribution. And this means that any budget for land reform will be spent very soon because the prices of land have increased enormously and the government has not been able to buy many farms under in this kind of mechanism.
So are we looking at the kind of criticism of the government here in an agricultural setting that's been made of the ANC government, the post-apartheid government in other areas, that it was too quick to adopt a neoliberal market model and that's failed to deliver on the promises of the anti-apartheid movement?
Yes, definitely. And I think this has been shown in many places over the world, not only in South Africa, where neoliberal land reforms, but also the neoliberalizing of economies and agricultural economies has been detrimental for labor processes and for social relations in the countryside. Because that is also what is happening, is that the white farming community feels incredibly threatened. And this has resulted on the level of the farms in very tense relations and actually and racist kind of discourses and practices on the farms, because farmers have to justify their position in South Africa. They are being constantly challenged by the South African government to justify why they should control land and why they should also control the people and the resources on that land. And to do so, they present a narrative that they are the rightful owners and that they are the best people to farm the land because they have the knowledge and the capacity, and farm workers have not, because they are farm workers and they've been dispossessed of land a long time ago, and they are simply not capable and willing to farm the land as good and commercially as they do.
Mm. Are there more successful models available? I mean, some people say that the land reform in Zimbabwe, for instance, not the most recent grab as the Mugabe regime kind of degenerated, but the original model was a more successful one. Do you think that's true?
Well, it's true in some ways and it's not true in other ways. I'm not an expert on Zimbabwe, but I definitely think that it's important to recognize that in the South African context, in those places where people do receive land, people are first of all, very happy with that land because it changes the social relations. I am currently doing research on a farm that has been given to former farm workers. So the white owner has sold his farm to the state, and the state is giving it as a lease to the farm workers. And the farm workers are being productive in their experience. They are producing, they are selling on the market crops. And they are happy that they are governing the farm themselves and this is an important difference. They feel that the fact that they can make decisions of how to farm and how to build relations, who lives on the farm, under what conditions, that gives them a sense of belonging. And what I've seen on the farms where I do research in the Eastern Cape context, white farmers are also looking for that sense of belonging and that justification for that they should remain on the land. but this results in an even stronger sense of holding on to the land and ensuring that they are asserting their authority by showing that they are the ones with knowledge, and by putting other people and keeping people in position so that they can never challenge that power or challenge that knowledge. And this is, I think, very unsustainable.
Just to talk a little bit about the situation of the farm labourers, because obviously land ownership and farm labour are two very separate things. South Africa, of course, has a very strong history, and indeed some people attribute the sort of final demise of apartheid to the strength of the black trade union movement. Was there no effective correlate of that movement for agricultural labourers?
Well, first of all, farm laborers in South Africa have only received the rights to unionize and to organize in the early 90s. So there is no historical tradition like there has been in more urban settings of strong South African black laborers unions. And due to the nature of farm labor in South Africa, and like I said before, farm laborers often also live on the farm and have for ages or for decades negotiated not only wages but also living conditions, transport and other kinds of services with these white landowners. So the traditional union model is not applicable in this kind of labor relations, and which are much broader than than labor conditions. And also, depending where you are in South Africa, farm laborers are very scattered. Farms in South Africa are huge. It's not the same as in England or as in the Netherlands. Farms in South Africa are sometimes 5,000 hectares with 10 farm-dwelling families on them. So also to mobilize and to organize people in a context like that is much harder. And on top of that, they earn so little money, also because traditionally they earned very low wages, which was supplemented then sometimes with meat or services, that it's impossible to pay membership fees. So the traditional union model has never worked for farm workers. And we've also seen that in the recent farm worker strikes of 2012 and 13, where unions farm workers say themselves, they don't feel unions can represent them. They have a lot of negative experiences with unionists who tried to unionize them. So no, there has been no successful, in that sense, unionization of farm workers.
Okay, Dr. Brandt, we're running short of time, but just one final question. Is there any sign that this current spike in violence might produce some policy shifts which would begin to address those long-term problems that we've been discussing?
Well, what we're seeing in South Africa now is that the ANC-led government is definitely challenged on all fronts as a result of the Marikana violence against mine workers. There's the current student protests. There's the farm worker strikes that are ongoing. So I think the government is feeling that pressure definitely, and it's been introducing new policies when it comes to land reform, but people are very skeptical whether these are going to work or whether this is just more political rhetorics that will not lead in real social change for people who need it most.
Okay, Dr. Femke Brandt, thanks very much for joining us and discussing those developments in South Africa. But I'm afraid that's all we've got time for on this episode of The Report.